Last night I was reading through some comments on my YouTube channel, and I saw that one of the viewers, or they were essentially asking about what my thoughts were on Paul Wade's Convict Conditioning. Now, just to clarify, I'm talking about the Dragon Door Bodyweight Conditioning program. I am not talking about combat conditioning with Matt Fury, which I just did. So this is a different program, although it does have some similarities, and there's definitely inspiration being drawn from combat conditioning. Kind of a mixed bag of a program, but I think that it gets a little bit of a bad rap in certain circles, particularly on Reddit r/bodyweight fitness, which is where I really started my fitness journey. People were pretty critical of it at the time, and I think some of that criticism is valid and some of it's a little overblown, or rather just a result of people misunderstanding the intention of the original programming. I think you have to kind of go back in time to when that programming came out in the early to mid 2000s, and just remember that at that time calisthenics was not popular. It was not going through the renaissance that it would go through a few years later. For better or for worse, Dragon Door is usually kind of on the early end of a lot of those fitness trends. Being first doesn't always mean that you're going to be the best, if that makes sense. We have to think that they are working without the kind of established, infrastructure and training methodology that we now have for calisthenics. There was just not really a ton to go off of in terms of like widespread thoughts on calisthenics, where now it's a lot more uniform. I'll compare and contrast a little bit to the recommended routine on r/bodyweight fitness, which I don't think is a bad routine. I just think it kind of serves a different population. The way that Convict Conditioning reads to me is it's very much for the average Joe. That's the intended audience. It's for somebody who is not necessarily in great shape. You might be a bit older, you might have some previous injuries, but you really don't have a lot of formal training experience. So they're starting you from ground zero, essentially. And what that means is that there's going to be a lot of focus on just building technique. There's going to be a lot of focus on keeping it as basic as possible so that, a complete noob to physical training can follow it. And there's going to be focus on higher repetitions. I think the higher reps is probably the first thing that people get a little critical with convict conditioning for. It's definitely more of a muscular endurance focused program, but I actually think that's a really good thing. A lot of people now with calisthenics just want to look at it as a kind of a strict strength and conditioning perspective of building just strength as quickly as possible and building muscle mass as quickly as possible. Convict conditioning is not really for that. I think it's just for building a good base. So I think it's a pretty good beginner introduction program that just has a few weak points that have become obvious over the years. Anyways, I think the high repetitions is good for two reasons. One, I think it forces you to slow down progression-wise, which as a beginner, you are going to be rapidly progressing, and you can very quickly get into a point where your muscular strength is outdoing your connective tissue's ability to recover from stress. A lot of the exercises in convict conditioning, I think, are really focused on making sure that your connective tissue is actually strong enough to adapt to the stresses of calisthenics so that you don't get injured later on in the road. And the second thing is technique, which I think takes a lot more refining than people give it credit for. And so one reason I advocate for higher repetitions with quality reps, let me get that straight, not just doing junk reps, but one reason I'm a big fan of higher reps is I think it really forces people to just completely prioritize improving the technique, because they can't just go up in weight, go up in challenge. And so that's really important as a beginner. You're just building these basic movement patterns, basic mobility, basic connective tissue strength. Your convict conditioning would not sell very well if people were getting horribly injured from it. Ironically, the next grievance that people have with it a lot is that it's not a very balanced program, which I definitely agree with. Whereas I think that the muscular endurance, higher reps conditioning focus, being bad is a little overblown. I actually like that for beginners, specifically for beginners, because it's giving them time to just adjust to the strain without rushing to the finish line. and getting hurt. I'm definitely somebody who, I followed the recommended routine in its much earlier stages about 10 years ago. It's gotten a lot more refined now, so some of this stuff isn't as much of an issue. And I was coming from no strength and conditioning background really at all. And so I, unfortunately, as a result of being young and driven, I was progressing really fast, and I actually kind of quickly got to the point where I was outpacing what my connective tissue were able to do. So within, about the first 2 years of lifting first 2 years of calisthenics, I had already, gotten some injuries because I was stupid. I remember within probably the first 2 years, so I started calisthenics at like 15, and just did basically strict calisthenics for a year, and then I started lifting weights and calisthenics. And I know by the time I was 16, before I got my first big injury from training, which is my SI joint, I think at the time I was doing dips with I was about 187 pounds, doing dips with like 80 pounds of weight for triples, and then doing neutral grip chin-ups for about 75 pounds of weight for triples, which is way too fast. Like, anybody who knows anything about progression knows that that is not enough time for your connective tissue to catch up to that load. There's almost nobody on earth, unless you have like really good connective tissue genetics, who's going to get away with lifting 140% of their body weight within about 18 months and just, walk away from that consequence free. And so later on, I paid pretty dearly for that. I had a lot of bicep tendonitis, some elbow problems, a lot of shoulder pain, and I think I tracked that back to doing dips that were really heavy too fast. Going back to convict conditioning, I think the focus on not actually building up weight too fast is really important, especially when you consider heavier athletes. So I think convict conditioning is excellent if you are a bigger, bulkier athlete, if you don't really have the phenotype for calisthenics type training. Now we're at a point where there's enough people in calisthenics that a lot of these people who are kind of more built like gymnasts and have that really great power to weight ratio can really excel, which good on them. But listen, I'm almost 100 kilograms. I'm like 215 pounds right now. So I think that's like 96 kilograms, something like that. Forgive me for my shitty conversions. I think if you are a heavier person who's starting calisthenics later on, you need to be really conservative with your training. And so that focus on higher reps, that focus on building connective tissue strength is extremely important when you just have that extra body mass. That means there's a lot less room for error. You really need to be careful with what you're doing because you're just exposing your joints and connective tissue to a lot of pressure all at once. And you can get strong enough to do that in a healthy way. But I have seen a lot of heavier people just, kind of try to get to ripping out weighted pull-ups too quickly, particularly because they might have a lot of muscle mass that lets them, move heavy weighted calisthenics quickly and then pay pretty dearly for the consequences in terms of like their smaller joints and connective tissue in their elbows, things like that. The other thing to take into consideration is that at the time that convict conditioning came out, there really was not any sort of calisthenics equipment widely available. So there wasn't any calisthenics parks where you could have a low bar that you could do rows on, and there wasn't any gymnastics rings. There wasn't really a lot of stuff. The only thing you could really rely on was the pull-up bar being there. That's really the only thing that you could consistently have, is a bar high enough to do pull-ups on at the gym or at a playground, things like that. And so unsurprisingly, all the programming is focused on just using the pull-up bar for pulling and hanging movements, and then neglecting rows. So there are a few areas that convict conditioning has failed to address. And if you're talking about the holistic ones, which is there's convict conditioning 1, which is the main one that everyone's talking about usually. There's convict conditioning 2, which is essentially accessory exercises. So that does fill in for some of the gaps and kind of does a little bit more conditioning work as well. So I remember that there's forearm training, neck training, and lower leg training. And I believe actually the human flag, so you get a lot of lateral chain training. So I will say convict conditioning 2 addresses some of the smaller areas that are overlooked, but you still are missing a few key areas And Convict Conditioning 3 is about explosive calisthenics. It's like muscle ups and kips from the ground, which I think are great, but it's kind of a different ball game, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. You really don't see any mention of stuff like pike push-ups, or, you know, I guess they called Australian pull-ups at the time, but like bodyweight rows is probably what you're going to hear them called now, until you get to the CMAS booklet, which unequivocally the CMAS booklet is a piece of garbage. I think it's just so watered down. It's clearly just a hastily like written marketing thing where they saw that, oh, people are training calisthenics for physique, let's just like kind of do a half-assed little thing. But it's just it's such watered down stuff. It's like, oh, do body weight rows. You're like, okay, cool, that's useless information because I already figured that out a long time ago. So what are you going to give me that's useful? I'm getting a little long-winded here. But the three glaring weak points in the I'd say the Convict Conditioning program, there's a lack of hip hinges. They do have the bridge, which is a hip hinge, but it's also predominantly a mobility movement. I like bridging a lot, but I have done, you know, enough of it to realize that it's more of an accessory movement, and you should still be doing Nordic curls, hyperextension, some other sort of kind of like hip hinge, posterior chain movements. And then the other glaring one that's pretty obvious is the lack of rowing. I think this is a really egregious oversight for two reasons. One is that I think rowing is one of the most important exercises you can do to avoid injury. So it really goes against the ethos of convict conditioning to not have rowing incorporated. But I also understand where they're coming from, where they know that a lot of the people they're working with wouldn't have bars that were low enough to actually do rows at the time. So that's a luxury of our current state of fitness, is that we actually have more resources for calisthenics training. And so that's a nice thing that we don't have to stick to. The other ironic thing is one of the best ways to build up to pull-ups is to build your body weight rowing strength. I think rows are great because you can really train them for high reps. You can really condition your elbows, your posterior chain, your core with body weight rows and not have a ton of fatigue relative to the amount of stimulus you're getting. So I think it's a huge oversight. And I think the third thing is just the lack of lunges. I think lunges are great. The squatting movements that they focus on are basically building up to the pistol squat, which I think is all right, although I probably prefer a shrimp squat if I were to pick between the two. Anyways, that's kind of like a minor thing. But the problem is I think that with lunges, the main thing that you want to focus on is, like, besides building up the hamstring, which again, convict conditioning does really no direct hamstring work at all, which I think is a big oversight in terms of injury risk. Besides that, there is just, of course, the risk of not training your glutes at all. And I think hip injuries, while not necessarily as common as something like shoulder injuries, because people focus on upper body a lot in calisthenics, like hip injuries can be pretty devastating. I have had one, and it's really just hip and low back injuries. It's like they can really set you back. They can really inhibit your training. And so I think the lack of lunges was a pretty big mistake, because that's leaving a lot of strength and frankly some more like lower body hypertrophy on the table. For the first 2 points, the focus on muscular endurance I don't think is a bad thing. You just have to remember that they're focusing on people who are deconditioned, who need a lot of time and a lot of work to get to a point where their connective tissue and their body is ready to do the next exercise effectively. So I don't think that's a bad thing. And one of my grievances with the recommended routine, while I think the exercise selection is good, I wish that there was an emphasis on a wider range of reps. You basically get 3 to 5 by 8, and I think that people fall into the fallacy then of thinking that there's not a lot of utility in going up into these higher rep ranges, when really, with a lot of these calisthenics movements, I think if you're going up to getting, say, 20 pull-ups per set, if you're, you know, a decently conditioned person, you're going to get a ton out of that before then moving on to weighted pull-ups. So I think it kind of creates a little bit of a false expectation where you think, oh, I should just get to the heaviest progression as fast as possible, when really taking a little bit more of a incremental route can do a lot of good for you. I also just think muscular endurance in calisthenics is pretty important. Like, you need a baseline of work capacity in order to tolerate the higher intensity sets. Like, when you're really getting into like the higher intensity work, if you haven't built up that capacity to handle volume, you're really going to suffer for that. That's kind of a personal opinion. And I can see people arguing against it. You know, maybe some people really just want to do, if you're the average person and you kind of just want to get fit enough, it doesn't really matter too much, and you just kind of want to do what's fun and enjoyable, then, you know, more power to you, and you don't necessarily need to do it. But if you're thinking really long term, I think building up those high reps is going to do a lot of good for you. I think the other issue is much more valid, which is the lack of, like, the program is not balanced. But I think that if you're able to essentially do what you're doing for these convict conditioning exercises, but integrate these movement patterns that you don't have. So having lunge progressions, having row progressions, and then having hip hinge progressions. Honestly, I would just go ahead and take that from the recommended routine, because I do think they have done a pretty good job of picking fairly generalist exercises that are going to help you get to the next stage. I think if you do that with the kind of, you know, micro progressions, hitting really high rep targets and very good form before you move on to the next, I think that adding that in makes convict conditioning a lot better. I also think that convict conditioning too is excellent in that it starts kind of introducing targeted accessory work. The one thing I do not like the neck training. It's a lot of neck bridge type stuff, and I do not think that's personally productive for a lot of people. I think it's going to cause a lot of neck pain. If you're going to do body weight training, neck training, you can just do like body weight neck extensions, or my preferred thing is like isometrics against the bench, where you're keeping your neck in a straight, not compromised position, but you're still training it to resist against weight. And so that's the one thing I don't like. However, the forearm training I think is totally fine, and I think that's pretty good. That's a pretty good thing to work on, because that's just integral in calisthenics. And then obviously the calf and lower leg training and the human flag training, I think that's all great. Although I do think the human flag is an awesome goal to get to. I wish that there was a little bit more, I guess, progression besides just do the human flag, because it is a very hard thing for somebody who's like larger with longer limbs like me to build into. So I wish there was a little bit more guidance on that. So then we come to the third issue, I guess you could say, with convict conditioning. So to reiterate, the first two issues, we've got a focus on very high reps, which some people don't like. I think it's fine. And then we've got a lack of balance in the programming, which is a glaring issue, and I think a big fault of convict conditioning. The final thing, though, is the progressions themselves. I've gone through the higher levels of these progressions. I actually used it a few years ago to get back into calisthenics shape after taking kind of a long layoff from that. So the early progressions I think are great. The later progressions are where the system really falls apart. So I'll kind of go case by case. I think the ones where it really falls apart, number one, the handstand push-up progressions, not very good. So the final step is a one-arm handstand push-up, and they clearly just took a photo of the model doing essentially an isometric at the bottom, because as of yet I have scoured the internet and there is really nobody on earth that I have seen attempt a one-arm handstand push-up and do it successfully. And this is like years later with some of the most advanced calisthenics athletes. I think you run into a situation where not only is just the amount of weight that you're lifting on one arm pretty astronomical, even if you're somebody who's very light, say you're 120 pounds, that's still almost 120 pounds on one arm. That's like a phenomenal amount of pressing strength that is like very elite. So I think that's out of the reach of most people. I also think that, from what I can tell, the rotational challenges that you encounter with a one-arm push-up are just magnified dramatically when doing it with a one-arm handstand push-up. And so the closest you'll find is people who do these weird monstrosity like side elbow lever kind of legs twisting and flailing thing. It's a disaster. However, I have seen people do basically the assisted variation pretty successfully. So that's where one hand is elevated on like a stack of books, for example, and the other hand is doing a handstand push-up. And so I think that that is actually achievable. But in the course of kind of doing the 10 steps and having an impressive photo, they were kind of willing to do some deceptive marketing stuff, which really frustrates me. And it's one of my biggest grievances with the book. I think it's like, you could have just had an earlier progression instead of doing this thing and kind of deceiving consumers who don't know any better. And it creates, I hate in fitness when you see this marketing that creates kind of a false expectation. I think it can be really harmful for people. And because you at a certain point realize it's a false expectation, and you just can't help but become disappointed. And so anyways, that's really disappointing. The one arm pull-up training, you can get to the final step. I just think it's, once again, not the most efficient way, and there needs to be more progressions. Essentially, it's more than 10 steps to get to something like that. That's a skill that is achievable, but very difficult to achieve. I think the one arm push-up training, it's pretty good until the end. I've not gotten to a full one arm push-up, but I did about 8 steps into that. The bridge training is fine. I think that's actually the one that's the most realistic, because it's the most incremental. And I find that the leg raises were good too. The one thing I wish with the leg raises was that there's a little bit more guidance about going beyond. I thought the pistol squat progressions were okay. I wish there were, just for that one and for the bridges, there had been more of an emphasis on building mobility. I think they just sort of tell you to work on mobility, but they don't really give you any sort of guidelines for that. And that's really only relevant for the bridges and for the pistol squat, but it is like the limiting factor at a certain point becomes not strength, it just becomes mobility. Because they're trying to break everything into 10 steps, some of the steps get a little bit arbitrary. And there's also a huge difference in the difficulty of these things. You get to, you have something like leg raises, which are pretty achievable. I'd say that they are like low level intermediate skill, if that. And that's for somebody with like long, heavy legs. So you can build up to leg raises pretty quickly if you are, doing it with decent form. You can build up to bridges and pistol squats somewhat quickly. One arm push up kind of in the middle. And then the one arm pull up, for some people would be a lifetime goal. And the one arm handstand push up literally doesn't exist. So you kind of see this thing where they're creating sort of a false equivalency, where you think that all these things should be roughly about the same level of difficulty, but they're not at all. So I also think that once you get to something like the pistol squat, I believe it says to do just keep doing pistol squats instead of adding weight or doing other variations, or just using a barbell, sandbag, kettlebell. I think that's pretty ridiculous. I do like to go into higher rep sets of 20 to 30, but I think for the most part, if you're getting to sets of 50 or 100, you're no longer getting that much utility out of it compared to just doing something that's a little bit harder. And so I thought that was pretty silly. And then I think for the one arm push-ups, it's the same kind of thing of you get that, and then they just say build up to 50 one arm push-ups. And you're like, okay, well, how many people can really do 50 one arm push-ups with good form? I think there's probably a handful of people in the world who can do that. Definitely less than 1% of calisthenics athletes, I'm guessing. Once you get to that progression, there's not a lot of utility in going any further. The other things that, I guess you should address if you do choose to read through these books, I think they're great. Of the 3, so I'll give the original Convict Conditioning, I'll probably give a 7 out of 10. It's got some issues. I think Convict Conditioning 2, I'd actually give an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Really, the only thing I dislike is the neck work, but everything else I think is pretty solid. And it's nice just to get a little bit more accessory work in and show what accessory work for calisthenics might look like. And so I think those are great. Convict Conditioning number 3, the explosive calisthenics ones, which I didn't really go over. I didn't go over that because it focuses on dynamic explosive movements. I think those are pretty great. Some of the progressions are a little bit but so far what I've done with that has been pretty instructive. And so I can't really provide too much insight on that because I haven't unlocked any of the skills yet. I haven't gotten to a full muscle up or a kick from the ground. And so I don't want to talk too much on that. But from what I've seen of that, that's probably the best of the 3. CBAS is basically a little booklet. It sucks. Don't read it. Anywhere on the internet you can find much better, more informative stuff about how to train for hypertrophy. Some of the things I like about it, I do like that it breaks up progressions into small steps. Obviously, the steps become progressively more difficult and sometimes exponentially more difficult. But it's good about showing that a lot of calisthenics is just about building these micro progressions in. And so I hope the takeaway that people get from that is not that you should just focus on 10 steps or whatever, but that it's okay to do as many progressions and regressions as you need to keep continuously getting stimulus and continuously improving. Besides that, I guess the one thing to address if you do read it is just prepare yourself for some really, really silly notice, because I've read a ton of their books pretty voraciously. I've read probably most of them. Their earlier books especially have really silly macho marketing. It's super over the top. It's clear that they paid copywriters a good chunk of money to basically go into, I don't know how to describe it, like toxic masculinity, hardcore macho, jock energy stuff. But it's really macho nonsense. And so I encourage you to get past the ad copy that you're essentially reading and just try to get to the actual information, because there is a fair amount of information there underneath some of the more ridiculous and dated, ad spiel that you're reading. So don't worry too much about that stuff. I think that can be a big turnoff for modern readers, just because our culture has hopefully evolved past that stage. Anyways, I digress. So overall, pretty good program, not a perfect program. I think if you were to make convict conditioning better, I would probably focus on getting as far along in the progressions as you can while integrating some of the other movement patterns, such as rows, lunges, and hip hinges, in order to build a more balanced body. And then I think once you get tired of it, and once you feel like you have a pretty good feeling about it, your joints don't hurt, you can rep out 20 pull-ups, you can rep out push-ups at a high level. So I think at that point you can go ahead and change over to, I guess, more mainstream programming or more specialized programming. So it's great for getting you to that beginner to intermediate stage, and then I would say just stop there. Don't get too wedded to the program at that point. It's good for getting you exposed to calisthenics, giving you an idea of what some of the common, weak pressure points that you need to work on would be. But it's not a perfect program. It's definitely a relic of its time. It can sometimes feel a little bit like a dinosaur. The last thing I'll say, I don't remember if they give a ton of guidance on how to actually increase reps overall. But the thing I did that I found extremely helpful was to just look at it solely as a muscular endurance training program. And what I mean by that was the way that I train for increasing my reps is I only focus on building my total reps up. So I'm not doing a high number of reps per set because I don't want to get too fatigued each set, but I do want to do a high enough number of total reps that I'm getting more used to that. So for example, I think I would do anywhere between 4 to 8 sets, and I would try to keep the numbers as low as possible. So if I wanted to do 12 reps, I might do 6 sets of 2. And the reason for that is that I could just really focus on building the form and building my muscular endurance, having sufficient breaks in between. And I found that that was super helpful. So just focus on it kind of as a muscular endurance training thing. Understand you're not going to get crazy strong, but that it's really about building your foundation so that you can build strength later on. I hope this kind of sheds some light on it. I do think they're worth reading if you can bear to get past the ad copy.